Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Zoe Carlson. I'm a volunteer with Andean Textile Arts, a nonprofit organization based in the US, which for the past 24 years has supported the people of the Andes in their efforts to preserve and revitalize their textile traditions. So a few kind of housekeeping items before we get started. Please place your computer's Zoom screen view setting on full screen. So this way you can get the full visual benefit of Aymar's presentation. Please note the chat and raise hands functions have been disabled for this webinar. So if you have any technical difficulties, please use the Q&A function. And you can also use that Q&A function to type your questions and comments throughout the presentation. And at the end, we'll have some time for question and answer. And the ones for Aymar will be answered during that time at the end. So I'm very excited to introduce our speaker today and welcome Aymar Ccopacatty as he presents Andean textile traditions in contemporary art and beyond. Through sculpture, textiles, and installation, Aymar Ccopacatty's work combines traditional weaving techniques, indigenous knowledge, and environmental activism. During this talk, Aymar will discuss his work, his process, and why he uses only recycled plastic in his textiles. He will survey the decay in traditional textile techniques in the last 20 years and the reasons behind this. He will also cover the hidden language within traditional textiles, along with the profound misunderstanding of textile traditions by the West. In addition to his artistic practice, Ccopacatty consults with art institutions such as the Smithsonian Institution on Collection Care. So now it is my privilege to turn today's program over to Aymar.
Hey, everybody. Good afternoon. It's really an honor to share with you all. I was born in Peru in 1979, a bridge between white North America and Aymara indigenous cultures. I always recall being flooded with the smells, sounds, and experiences of being a small baby in Puno. I was my grandmother's firstborn grandson, and I got to spend time on her back in a beautiful woven awayu. Her generation were all expert weavers, both men and women. At the age of 4, we returned to my mother's life in Rhode Island. I spent the next 40 years firmly lodged in both cultures, which can be a really big challenge. This is my grandmother on the far right with her niece and my father. Around the age of 15, I observed the slow rollout of globalization. Things such as clothing, goods, and plastic products began changing the ancient indigenous culture that had survived the painful Spanish colonial period. I began to ask who would continue the old traditions, and specifically weaving. There are traditional gender roles for textiles, who makes what, so my grandmother began teaching me to knit chulios, the ear flap hats, and chuspas, a boy or man's bag for carrying food or coca leaf while herding sheep, as well as other techniques. Herding sheep, knitting, and making yarn from fiber on a drop spindle go hand in hand. I think what makes Andean weaving so dynamic is the portable nature of it. You really do get a deep sense of the underlying logic and language of the textiles when you get to see them used in daily context during life. From the braided whiskas that help tie harvest to a donkey, to the many different woven bags that are used for planting, harvesting, and ceremony, men's coca bags, single women's hats, and carrying shawls that carry anything and everything, including babies. All of these are examples of semiotic communication. We can still see a lot of this semiotic communication in use today in Andean textiles. We can still decode where someone or a weaving is from via specific colors, designs, technique, or a combination of all these things. I have been investigating quipu cords, and I will be presenting to the Memory Studies Association's annual conference in Lima, Peru, this coming July. I do believe that learning more about what quipu meant involves using this same semiotic logic while also studying relationships to all the indigenous languages still spoken today. A lot of the current investigations only focus on Quechua as a reference. The weaving you see here, I wove with my grandmother when I was around 17 years old. The design and technique is something common to the west side of Lake Titicaca. Through these experiences, I was able to gain a broad and basic understanding of weaving technique and, more importantly, the names of the loom parts and processes in the Aymara language. Translating all of this into contemporary art, or even creating a vehicle to monetary sustainability while maintaining cultural integrity, has been a lifelong challenge. Aymara culture is very horizontally structured and community-minded. Even despite 500 years of colonialism and postmodern runaway capitalism, accumulation is for everyone or no one. If you have a lot, you must share a lot. And I just think I'd like to add there about the recent protests last year in Peru, where about 60 unarmed indigenous protesters were killed by the government. Um, the Aymara people really, and the Quechua people, hold together, believe in community, and that we all should have a say. It really is democratic, but we have, as we will see further on, a lot of colonial ancestral wounds that we're still working on. During my time in art school, I began to combine these Andean techniques with recycled materials and adobe making. This is around the time I stopped using fiber in my textile art practice. It is definitely an obsession with being consequential about attempting to use all of the waste plastic produced by my postmodern lifestyle. Many indigenous elders say that our essence stays with anything we've touched. If you do the painful math of how many single-use plastics and packaging a single person may touch and discard in just 1 year, how many rooms would it fill? I feel it is a potent metaphor for the fragmentation present around the world today. It's like we're all in several places at once, and that can be a very unsettling feeling. This was a big reason I decided to only use the plastic that I go through in my daily life, or at least balance how much I use with other plastic that is better suited to weaving. Another reason, as I try to make my art and vision impactful in the elitist Western dominated fine art world, is a desire to not be relegated as a fiber artist. This is a ridiculous divide imposed between art and craft that I instinctively disagree with. The indigenous vision is that these things are all one and indivisible. Art, technology, and life are one. It would take me 14 years to go back to grad school. After graduating from Rhode Island School of Design with a BFA in sculpture in 2004, through time I spent interacting with Andean textile collections at the National Museum of the American Indian, these experiences helped me decide to study textile conservation. Graduating with a master's degree in 2021, I am very interested in the intersection of visual art and museum conservation that I now find myself in. I'm fueled by reverence for and in service to Andean textiles. This opens a very interesting space for me to highlight Aymara culture and hopefully create better conditions and intercultural understandings for improved stewardship of these unique objects in museum collections. This is some more of my studio art practice, weaving a plastic belt on the right and some plastic collage on the left. I definitely think it's important to think about how close Indigenous people are to art. which should be easily understandable if it's truly visual art, not separate from daily life, but referencing and as a part of it. Today, you see Indigenous artists highlighted at the Venice Biennale and other world-class art events, where even 5 years ago this would have been unheard of. It really makes you think about where global society has been and where we will be in the future. There really are many different art worlds, the majority of which through time have not known what to do with Indigenous art. Plastic Shaman was a performance piece as a final thank you to the RISD Museum for hosting me as a year-long research resident. Invoking the spirits of the Achachilas and Apu in Aymara with my father, we were blessing and awakening the energies of a few special Andean textiles from the collection that hadn't seen the light of day in many decades. Two of them contained human hair, which is as close to human remains as you can get. Also invoked were pre-Columbian bronze idols and colonial silver. I recently finished a consulting contract with the Smithsonian NMAI. My job was to reach out and ask how Indigenous groups in Central and South America feel about their sacred objects in museum collections. The answers were not easy, and I am hopeful that museums do feel compelled to listen and accommodate these other voices somewhat. These Indigenous groups ask questions such as, when a grave is encountered in the West, do people dig these up and display them in a museum? Why do museums only repatriate objects to the nation state a native group falls under, but not the group or ethnicity the object is directly related to? This and many other justified frustrations. Through combining textile conservation and art practice, it is my hope to arrive at a third way forward. One that reframes Andean textile collections in recognition of their spiritual dimension, the lives they led when created and used in life and before being buried as a prized possession to accompany the dead. It is a hard fact that most of the pieces in museum collections are looted burials. With the RISD Museum's Costume and Textiles Department, we are embarking on a pilot program that will be looking at the overall health of each Andean textile in the collection. How can we create better awareness and respect towards the energy they hold? How can museum staff show more respect to not just the scientific and physical considerations, but also the metaphysical aspects of these unique textiles? We will be assembling a list of best practices, taking into account collective intellectual property rights, repatriation, outreach to Indigenous communities, and other pressing issues. Art as life is circular. Sometimes when listening to our interior voices and the generations that come before us, we can see a clear path to walk. These drawings and small sculptures were made while in art school in 2003, in response to having learned the traditional boat-making techniques as a teenager. Almost 20 years later, I began to work with the reed boat techniques again, this time integrating new materials such as Phragmites reeds and recycled plastic. The current Aymara word for this boat is a walsa, but the 15th century Jesuit Aymara dictionary calls it a wambu. I actually prefer this term. These boats were made famous by Thor Heyerdahl's theories of pre-Columbian exploration across the Pacific Ocean. I spent years drifting around the dense Totora ecosystem in Lake Titicaca. These reeds, while native, were replanted by our ancestors during drought years. They are even lotted out according to family, since it is a primary natural resource also used to feed bulls, sheep, cuis, as well as thatch for roofs, sleeping mats, and many other uses. First, the reeds are harvested and cured. A traditional ply grass rope called pala is made from hichu grasses. Then, starting with 3 separate bundles of reeds, the boat is slowly woven together from one end to the next with the grass rope, requiring many repetitive tightening patterns. The technique is very textile influenced and applicable to making sculptures. We will see how this experience has continued to be a source of inspiration in my life and art. In 2021, my friend Sarah Cavaj asked me to participate in a watershed awareness project at the Independence Seaport Museum in Philadelphia. I was asked if it would be possible to build a reed wampu out of invasive Phragmites reeds. I didn't know, but I answered that we sure should try. After experimenting with Phragmites, I noticed how it has these hollow bamboo-like chambers that offer very little flotation. Unlike the totora reeds we use in Peru, I decided that recycled plastic would be the solution to help these Phragmites reeds float better. This was just as COVID restrictions had relaxed, so we were able to go to some of the local laundromats around Philly and collect used detergent bottles. It took a lot of time to rinse out and put a tight lid on each bottle to avoid polluting the water around the wampu. We then built 2 separate bundles of chicken wire filled with plastic bottles, lining the whole thing up with a third smaller bundle of Phragmites reeds in the middle, called the chuima in Aymara, which means heart. We then slowly began weaving rope in the same infinity pattern that you would illume, except the reeds would be the weft and the rope is the warp. This requires a lots of tightening back and forth, slowly working the slack out. The Phragmites is very slippery compared to totora reeds, and it is very hard to get the loops of jute to stop moving around. The project took about 4 people, approximately 3 weeks. It was interesting to see people's reactions to the process, which at times almost didn't seem believable. This seaport museum has a workshop producing incredibly technical wooden boats. At the beginning of the process, we must have looked funny with some jute rope, bundles of reeds, and a pile of plastic bottles. People were wondering, what were we doing and is it actually going to work? The successful results were a testament to thousands of years of cultural tradition and indigenous technology. And up on the upper right-hand corner there, you see a picture of my father and my 2 children came to inspect the work. Originally I was going to ask my father to help us do it, but it was COVID, so I was afraid for him. He's older. Um, and he was kind of worried too if I was going to remember how to do this. So it was really a proud moment. He was really happy that I had not forgotten what we learned together. This wampu is now a registered vessel in the Delaware River and has lasted much longer than originally anticipated. In honor of my ancestors' navigations around the largest high-altitude lake in the world, and further back adventuring across the Pacific Ocean to Easter Island and Polynesia, I am currently rehabilitating an old sailboat here in Rhode Island with the intention of creating a floating sailing art studio. Here we can see the striking similarities between the Peruvian totora on the left and the giant bulrush that grows in South Florida on the right. They're both native to their environments. This fact is part of a larger artistic investigation currently ongoing. I'm fascinated in the traditional knowledge that plants have an intelligence and how that intelligence interplays with the human imprint on the planet. This type of symbiosis may be our salvation. In 2022, I was asked to come back to Philadelphia to participate in an art exhibit titled Plastic Free Philly. I was commissioned to make a sculptural installation, which I titled That Sinking Feeling. It felt very good to freely explore these techniques with a focus on contemporary public art. This piece to me represents a synthesis of materials and processes I've been looking to achieve for many years. Using Phragmites as a local adaptation to practicing my indigenous traditions has been very fulfilling. In a sense, Phragmites and I are both invasive immigrants to the northeast of the US. This is one of the biggest motivations to using the Phragmites reeds and recycled plastic to make public art installations with a message. We are all children of our Mother Earth, and all have equal rights and responsibilities to her. People often react well, and sometimes even with anger, at public art. The sculpture on the left was vandalized and disappeared from a riverside in Providence, Rhode Island. It was a strange cathartic thrill to finally make something that affected someone enough to take their time to destroy it. My father is a lifelong indigenous metal sculptor and has had his work defaced and destroyed many times. We always label it the iconoclastic Western response to native expression. In a sense, we proudly represent living idol worship. For in our times of gender, pronoun, LGBTQ, and every other kind of equality, I feel we still gloss over some of the most egregious and damaging cultural repression that was brought from the Vatican upon the indigenous Americas, and is in many ways still unchecked, unspoken, and unhealed. Speaking of idol worship, this project is based on my family history, as cited in Ramos de Gavilan, a Spanish chronicler active in Titicaca in 1619. It's a long story for another day, but there is a small town on the Bolivian side of the lake with my last name. There was once an idol dedicated to the serpent and the frog, which would see to giving the all-important rain for an abundant agriculture. The Ccopacatty idol was ordered destroyed by a Catholic priest in the early 1600s. My father and I are determined to recreate the idol that once sat here, receiving ceremonies and prayer to continue the equilibrium of Mother Earth and the cosmos. Because the reigning spiritual system has not proved itself morally capable of properly caring for our lives and environment. This ancestral wound and resulting banishment to the silver mines of Potosi is only a part of the path my family has walked to continue and exist in present days, with our last name a reminder. One result of this is a magnetic, though painful, attraction to metal work of all kinds. Between learning to weld from my father and his endless quest making transformative metal sculptures, to bronze foundry work, and earning my daily bread through years of metal fabrication. We were feared and we were not allowed to finish our ceremony. Art is spiritual and is ceremony. It can heal all wounds. My father and I have gone to the small town of Ccopacatty several times, meeting with the local community. This stone on the left is the most likely place where the idol lived. So we're very excited to someday put the idol back carved in stone. I want to take a moment to deeply describe the semiotic meanings inherent in an Aymara woman's awayu. Andean culture is dualistic, and all things in our lives are divided up by this duality. It represents complementary opposites, gender, positive, negative, upper, lower, sun and moon, etc. So this awayu was woven in two hemispheres separately and joined by the elaborate stitching in the middle, outwardly towards each selvage edge. Andean weaving is unique in that each weaving has 4 complete selvages, and this also speaks to the semiotic communication we keep touching on. This integral technique speaks volumes to our cosmovision. It is circular, no beginning and no end, literally the infinity symbol of all encompassed within. The process used to accomplish this is difficult to describe over video, but basically, since Andean weaving is so flexible, we start weaving warp-faced in one direction, then as you get towards the end, you rearrange the loom to start from the other end using the same string heddles and meet about 3/4 in the middle. This requires reducing shuttle size as you go until you have just one long needle known as a yauri pulling weft threads string by painstaking string through the warp until finishing the weaving. Usually you can pick out an area of weft strings that stick out a little more on either side of an Andean weaving and identify the technique. So nothing is ever cut and sewn. My critique of the globalized artisanal marketplace has to do with the introduction of Eurocentric designs at the cost of ancient weaving traditions. The Andean indigenous cultures have an essence and spirit that will always persist, but we are also losing another round of deep cultural knowledge and practice. This piece is an example of two traditionally woven textiles cut up and sewn into a modern style jacket. This happened for many years. Now there are not as many older textiles to serve this sad practice. It now instead happens with popular machine-made imitations. Globalization has been working at passive cultural degradation for well over 20 years. Secondhand charity donations of clothes from North America are actually sold by the pound upon reaching Peru. And then again in small markets throughout the countryside to people who would otherwise be producing and maintaining ancient textile traditions. While this is an important source of income and a source of cheap, warm clothes for a sometimes harsh, high-altitude environment, there's no balance with local customs. I think it is really important to prioritize a market philosophy that would educate consumers and push proactive rather than passive support for our Andean textile traditions as they exist, without modifying them, recognizing the meaning and value they hold outside of the visual design appeal of just how beautiful they are. In this way, it could be possible to avoid the consumer-driven market. In our case, the Andean textiles should be respected for what they represent as inverse to the Western economic model. Something that takes so long to make. You know, the weaving I showed you 2 slides ago probably took 3 months every day, minimum 3 months. Very non-capitalist use of time. In this way, it could be possible to avoid the consumer-driven market. Just as the reasons for making them are very different, so should the reasons for consuming them be. Consumers could be positively guided to deeper cultural interaction by consuming Andean cultural values along with the weavings. In 2012, I was a participant in the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indians Artist Leadership Program. I was financially supported to work with youth in the San Juan Children's Shelter in Puno, Peru. Teaching the kids basic knitting techniques with recycled plastic was rewarding. Through this and in partnership with artisan groups, we produced thousands of knitted plastic keychains out of recycled plastic. I was surprised to learn that knitting and crochet used to be a mandatory high school class in Peru's public education system. Textile techniques have a rhythm and meditative quality that can help people therapeutically stay in the moment, learn concentration and focus that seems especially important in these online-driven times. The experience of making thousands of knitted keychains was very satisfying, but unfortunately, the project did not have the kind of support I had wished from the marketing, and computer side of things. Nobody can achieve these things alone, and it's been hard to find the right kind of support so that a project like this could attain its true potential. I am currently exploring modern methods to self-sustain this vision, such as crowdfunding, in order to make all these projects viable over the long term. My two parents have dedicated their whole lives to visual art, and I have seen them in cycles of realizing incredible projects and also struggling to make ends meet. Times have changed so very much in the digital age. There are urgent spaces to fill with Indigenous presence, logic, and semiotic messages for the generations that follow behind. As a part of this project with the NMAI, I determined to make a large wifala out of recycled plastic. The wifala flag is a symbol of Andean identity, and its elements can be traced back to Inca times, representing the rainbow and also the chacana, or Southern Cross star constellation, that guides our agricultural cycles. I started taking trips to the garbage dump on the outskirts of Puno, a frightening and necessary experience, to find enough colored plastic. It took about a month of collecting bags of certain colors to recover enough materials. This was probably around 10 years before COVID-19, and the best red plastic was the medical waste bags broken open and blowing in the high altitude breeze. Once I had collected, sorted, washed, and dried the many different colored plastics, I drew out the squares and measured each one and started knitting colored strips with modified giant knitting needles. The knitting took about 3 weeks and the results were wonderful. The goal was to share the idea that we can occupy the past and present at the same time. We can think about modern plastics while respecting our traditions. In a postmodern lifestyle, I feel like it's hard to get the time and space to work exclusively on impactful, large-scale projects such as this. It was really satisfying to see my work examined and thought about by local Aymara and Quechua people. Some of the comments and reflections were really interesting. This was a time when I received significant operating support to be able to push my artistic vision further out into the everyday Andean world. As a working artist, these times dedicated completely to fulfilling the vision are so special and so necessary. Here we see some of the process of making a large-scale ear flap chulio. We will see more of this on the next slide. It is the same process using modified knitting needles that I used in the Wifala textile shown earlier. So on the left and the right, you see images of this large-scale chulio that I made in 2010 in Puno during presidential elections. The work is titled Chulio for a New Leader, and Peru now has the 7th president in 6 years. We are on quite a tear in Peru. There's a huge political problem where the elite have so completely stacked the deck and hacked the system that the majority of Peruvians cannot get their democracy fulfilled by the Congress or the presidency. This piece is now in the collection of the Museum of International Folk Art in Santa Fe, New Mexico. I also built a loom from local recycled parts seen in the center. I've had several experiences building looms and sharing weaving publicly with Andean people. This project was in Bolivia in 2010. Textiles are still such a big part of popular culture in the Andes, and the reception to these performance art pieces has always been positive. I do wonder how it will be as the generality of the techniques lessens greatly with each passing year. The certainty is that organizations such as Andean Textile Arts are few and far between. We would hope that more work can be done towards seeding these kinds of efforts to strengthen existing textile traditions in different regions of the Andes, where the traditions still live on in anonymity. I thank you all for listening. Please follow my work and help me find ways to continue and carry out the vision in the future. I think we might have just enough time to show a small video. It's just a quick thing about the loom I made in Santa Fe. Enjoy. My name is Aymar Ccopacatty. I'm 38 years old. I work with recycled materials like plastic in my art. We went to a moving store to get the pallets that we changed into the heddles.
Okay, so I imagined you here all night building a loom. I had no idea what this was going to look like. This is really cool.
We went to a hardware store because sometimes we need real heavy-duty deal things like pulleys that you can't easily find them in trash. And then we went to the local supermarket to get all of their 1 day's worth of shrink wrap, with which we made the whole loom. And that was just 1 day's worth of their shrink wrap. Every day, that much shrink wrap comes to Santa Fe for one store. And that's kind of the larger picture, is like, the worst thing people can do is assume that big companies have taken care of this for them, and therefore we don't have to do our part. We all have to do our part. The city here in Santa Fe or in other places outlawing a plastic bag doesn't mean, oh, it's dealt with and I don't need to think about this. There's so many things where you could get lulled into a sense of reassuredness that it's all being dealt with, but then you've been ployed and you've been lured into this mass marketing thing where you just mindlessly continue consuming. And they don't want you to hear, like, don't buy. I'm not saying don't buy. Go buy stuff. Just bring your own bag. Bring your own coffee mug. Refill things. Some of the spiritual lessons of my ancestors in Peru go that some of our essence, our spiritual essence, is on everything we've touched along the way in life. So if you follow that through to its logical conclusion, how many to-go cups have passed through your hands this year, 12 months? How many straws? And on and on and on. So it would take up the back of your car's worth. If it could all just fall on you right now by accident, everything you touched this year and threw in the trash. You know, how much of that should have gone into recycling instead of the trash, and now it's in the landfill instead of being turned into your next plastic cup. So it's an obsession, and it's not always comfortable, but it's more than a hobby, and it's good for people to think that way. It's important, and if more people thought that way, I wouldn't have to be so obsessed. Weaving, because it's the closest way I had from my tradition in the Andes Mountains. It's the closest tradition I had with which to address the plastic. So it's the tool I chose. I've also done experiments where it's visual art with the plastic. So it's not just weaving, but weaving is the most obvious spot where I'm uniting past and present and future. One of the things that the weaving loom made out of recycled materials does, or one of the visions it holds, is that it can trap pieces of plastic. It's a place to put handfuls of plastic refuse that would be blowing in the breeze, so if in the right moment a plastic bag blew in with the wind, it would get trapped in the loom and stuck in the weaving, and then it would be in the museum again. So it's a better place for it, and my work kind of does that. It looks for ways to encase or encapsulate the plastic.
Thank you so much, Aymar. That was such an interesting talk, and you brought up so many just topical conversations and questions um, in the art world and beyond. So now we have some time for a couple of questions. And again, if you have a question you would like to ask to Aymar, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We have a couple words of thanks in here. One question that came in was, when we visit Peru, folks in this group, and buy an item such as an unku from the weavers, how can we use and display it in a way that respects its meaning and its energy?
That's a great question. I mean, don't just keep it on the wall and let the sun bleach it, take it for a walk. You have a moment that's important in your life, like a graduation or a event of something, bring it with you. Textiles like to and that's a conservation thing too. You get lines, crease lines and things that aren't good for textiles if they're kept in one position for too long. And that's also energetic, the life it had before, the energy it had when it was made are, activated and happier when you don't put it in a frame on a wall. That would be more of like a Western idea of display, decoration instead of you know cultural consequence. It's not a merely decorative piece. Um, and next time you go to Peru, kind of ask, or can I see, what this weaving is used for in a daily life? Um, yeah. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. Yeah, I like that idea of taking it out for a walk. That's really beautiful. So we have a question here. Do you feel that museums will collect art made from plastic? It seems that it will be problematic to conserve.
Oh yes, very problematic. The piece that's in the collection of the Museum of International Folk Art. That was before I was interested in textile conservation. It may have had something to do with it too. Um, I get to have an appointment with the conservator, and she walked me through why she recommended, but she didn't recommend, but she said that this piece will be problematic to conserve. I think that if you keep pushing, a museum may have to accept an object in its collections that is problematic to conserve. Um, and that's kind of the point. Uh, kind of a little needle in the side there about, what things are made out of, what belongs in a museum, what doesn't. Um, if you've accepted a 1,000-year-old textile made of fiber, why should you have to accept a modern textile made of plastic? Well, because you asked for the 1,000-year-old textile dug up from someone's grave, so now you got to put up with a plastic one too. Um, those are just some off the head kind of ideas as to the importance of it, of kind of pushing the boundaries around and giving people kind of like cosmic jokes, to cause us to think a little deeper. Like we have an Andean clown, a cusillo, amongst the Aymara that kind of shows us how not to do things. So that humor isn't always just laughing. Sometimes it's illustrative and gives us pause, creates unique problems for us to think about. Thank you.
Thank you. We have another question here. How are the thoughts of repatriation being handled differently now? Do you think repatriation to Indigenous groups will gain momentum?
Well, I don't know that it's being handled differently yet. I think that yeah, that's really why I'm really excited to be embarking on this pilot project with the RISD Museum, and I really want to carry that forward anywhere I can. Is asking these bigger questions. When I was doing consulting work for the Smithsonian, it was a part of the pilot project there, um, to realize that the federally recognized tribes of North America, the law that these were started under is different from the law that governs Latin America, which comes from Spain's legal canons, um, where the tribes don't own the mineral rights to underground or the air above their lands. And the nation state, specifically in Peru, does not want to give the indigenous people any rights at all, especially in the Altiplano. The the Amazon tribes have more chances to get actual recognition from the government as an indigenous tribe. So in many ways, if you follow that logical thought process through, the government of Peru is indirectly or directly occupying the same role as the Spanish conquest. Is it a government for of the people in democratic terms, or does it represent still to this day an occupying force? It's a big question, because if you're not going to recognize the indigenous sovereignty and that the indigenous cultures and languages of the Altiplano existed way before there was anything called a nation state of Peru, well then you're an occupier. You're not interested in the vote. You're not interested in your people. That's what we're doing right now. It's a really painful process that we're going through. I hope it goes better in the future than it has been in Peru specifically. But that is a big barrier to repatriation, because if the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian has a beautiful textile that they would like to repatriate to a community in Cusco or Puno, if they're willing to do it, they have to go through the government of Peru. They can't go directly to the indigenous tribe of Quechua or Aymara people, because those groups don't have the designation legally as the United States tribes do as a sovereign nation. And that's a big hangup. So that's like dragging politics into it, but it's impossible to avoid. And another thing is that there's going to be a crisis of archaeology, because there's so many burials getting dug up by archaeology in Peru, and none of it stays in Peru. It all goes straight to museums, private collectors, chopped up and sold. I mean, I don't think they're chopping the actual textiles up anymore, which is nice, because they used to just do that. But these objects are flying off the market shelves, and it's like Peru has that much wealth, traditional cultural wealth under the ground, that I don't know if they're ever going to stop finding things. And it's under the guise of science. Oh, we have to study this stuff. So now it has to go to museum, in Holland, or, Germany requires 10 textiles from this new find. The other day I had a news article open, they had found like 40 tombs. And none of the stuff is staying in Peru. And if it is staying in Peru, it's going to the capital city of Lima, and none of it's staying where it was dug up. And there's a lot of, scientific reasons. Well, you don't have climate control. You don't have anyone who understands museology, or you don't have anyone who understands conservation. So part of the project we're undertaking at the RISD Museum, when I have that part in there talking about intellectual property rights, thinking down the line, if someone discovers some incredible plant dye that's 5,000 years old, it's going off the cuff, but it's like a cure for cancer also, and now it's it's made a pharmaceutical company $1.5 billion, then at least 0.5% of that should go to help people in Peru study museology, study textile conservation, help them open local community museums where these things are dug up. But the problem is that we can't count on the government of Peru to stick up for us and say, yes, we want half of these objects to stay in the community, the local community it was dug up, even if they don't have the argument would go, oh, these are no longer native people here. They haven't moved anywhere in 500 years. They don't speak Quechua anymore. Oh, well, then they're obviously not native people. And then that is a degrading kind of process where then the people themselves say, oh, yeah, I have cultural shame, amnesia, I don't speak Quechua. But if there's a museum, a local community museum, stuffed full of incredible textiles and things from the ancestors that were dug up in this community, well, then that community might have a little bit more pride in their past. They might say, oh, I remember my grandpa spoke Quechua. I remember my father spoke Quechua. I'd like to relearn it. Oh, maybe I'll learn how to weave. You'd have that kind of feeding back into cultural pride instead of, the kind of ruling elite model of the nation state trying to deculturalize, take our languages away, strip us of everything, including the past, the pre-Columbian objects. So that's what I mean when there is potentially a crisis in archaeology, because look at how things have changed since George Floyd was murdered in the United States and around the world since then. I feel like there's a lot more movement towards equity and towards inclusion. So how do you do both things? You can't carry on with like the last century's archaeological practices if then you have to answer these questions like, are you being inclusive? Are you trying to keep these objects in the communities that they were dug up in? Because once you dig them up, yes, you have to do something with them, because then people are just going to take them, unfortunately, because they don't have the aforementioned lack of opportunities and education and pride. So they'll just dig them up and sell them illegally. There's a huge black market for these objects. So that's a long answer.
Well, I appreciate you bringing our attention to a lot of these really important issues that are going to require a lot of work. We have a couple more questions here for you. One from Daniela. Congratulations for the efforts. I'm a Bolivian textile designer, and it is sad the abandonment of our traditions. I'm also working in the preservation as much as I can. What do you think about educational programs for our countries? What approach can they have?
Yeah, that's wonderful. I think that it's important, the kind of work that ATA does in Cusco. I always wish there was an Aymara version of that in Bolivia. I spent years in Bolivia with a small group of weavers who were trying to do something like that. And I want to be honest, I am aware of the really important help that ATA had in the very beginning. I think it was from the Frankenmonths, but I might be wrong. Please correct me. But I know there's really heavy institutional support from North America for many, many, many years, decades, correct? That is so important. There is no other, as far as I know, and correct me if I'm wrong, effort anywhere near that to help indigenous traditional textiles of the Andes. So that means a lot, that level of support. And it's tough because, it's like, oh, well, we don't want to take anything from so many weavers, so much traditions that strive to keep things together. And we don't want to say, oh, they couldn't do it by themselves. They needed this North American nonprofit to help them along for many years. We're not trying to say that either. but the opportunities for cultural exchange, there's just so many things. Like, you are dealing with a system that started here in the first world, or in Europe in the first world. So it is justified and fair that the first world helps to support things in a sustainable format in Latin America. Because, as I keep going back to, you can't trust the nation states to assist you, because unfortunately their MO, the things that guide them, are different. They would like it to be easier if we would just stop speaking native languages, stop trying to do these traditional things, and all learn English. That's also, the US embassies in South America, um, push English classes, and everyone says, "Oh, I want my grandson to speak English. Will you teach him English?" And I say, like, "Well, why didn't you teach him Aymara or Quechua first, and then I'll teach him English?" Because we're just losing so much language and tradition. So I think it's important for educational programs to exist. Um, I think it's important that they're supported. I have a really hard time with the way tourism is carried out in the Andes, because it's kind of quantity over quality, and there are some small initiatives around Lake Titicaca and stuff, to have small scale community tourism, but then it's like, oh, well, we don't have hot water here. So then people visiting can have a hard time with that. But I think that it's important, when you do travel, to, have an open mind and try to go to indigenous communities that have community tourism. Try to support that. You're the consumer, you have weight, your choices matter. Try to make sure the tour guides that speak English are not kind of like um unfair middlemen. Try to dig into that. If you don't speak Spanish, find someone who does, who's not your tour guide, and kind of go or loop around and make sure that this person, you don't have to be mean, but you can say, "Hey, are you spreading our benefit out to the horizontality of artisans, or are you just working with only one family, and then that family is doing so much better than everyone else?" It's like, be aware of how your impact matters.
Well, thank you for that. I think we'll probably wrap up here. I'll just share one more comment from Sandra, who says, just to say thank you to Aymar for his work. The artists who work in textiles in Bolivia and Chile greatly admire Aymar's work and research. Sincere and important for our time.
That's Cesaro.
Um, so with that, I just want to thank you again, Aymar, for your presentation today. And just a reminder that we are going to be sending out a link for the recording to today's talk. And you'll be able to view that for a month, maybe longer, but at least a month. And remember that if you enjoyed this conversation and have been intrigued with what you have learned, we hope you'll sign up for our mailing list and join us for future programs and our 2025 tours to Bolivia and Peru. So just one more thank you again to Aymar, and have a good rest of your evening.
Thank you.